Welcome to Real Crime Stories. Here we dive into real crime stories accompanied by the soothing sound of rain. A blend of mystery and tranquility to keep you company. Ready to hear the story? Let's begin. The murder of Laci Peterson. In December 2002, the peaceful town of Modesto, California, was rocked by the disappearance of Laci Peterson, a young woman who was 8 months pregnant with her first child. Her husband, Scott Peterson, reported her missing on Christmas Eve, claiming that she had gone for a walk in the afternoon and never returned. This disappearance would soon turn into one of the most high-profile criminal cases of the early 21st century. Laci's disappearance initially seemed like a tragic missing persons case, one that could have involved foul play, but there were numerous twists and turns that ultimately led to a shocking revelation. The investigation into her whereabouts quickly turned into a homicide investigation, with the focus narrowing onto Scott Peterson, her husband. Scott Peterson, a 30-year-old fertilizer salesman, was described as a charming, handsome man, someone who appeared to have it all. He was well known in the community, married to Laci, a 27-year-old woman known for her kindness and dedication to her family. She was pregnant with their unborn child, a boy who they had already named Connor. The couple's seemingly perfect life made the news of Laci's disappearance all the more puzzling. As investigators began to examine the case, it became clear that there were inconsistencies in Scott Peterson's story. Early on, there were suspicions that he might know more than he was letting on. Peterson's behavior was odd for someone whose wife was missing. He was calm during interviews, and his demeanor seemed detached. Moreover, Peterson's account of what happened on the day Laci disappeared did not add up. He told police he had gone fishing at the Berkeley Marina that afternoon, but evidence would later suggest otherwise. In the weeks following her disappearance, search efforts intensified. The authorities used ground search teams, helicopters, and even boats to comb the area where Laci had last been seen. A public plea for help from the Peterson family brought national attention to the case, but it also put a microscope on the couple's life. Peterson's behavior raised alarms, as he was often seen smiling or laughing in public, a stark contrast to the grief expected from someone in his position. By January 2003, the investigation took a critical turn. On April 13, 2003, 4 months after Laci Peterson's disappearance, a fisherman discovered the bodies of Laci and her unborn son, Connor, on the shore of the San Francisco Bay, not far from where Scott Peterson had claimed to have been fishing on the day Laci went missing. The discovery confirmed that Laci had been murdered, and it was clear that Connor, her unborn son, had also died as a result of the same brutal act. Forensic evidence quickly pointed to Scott Peterson as the primary suspect. The bodies were discovered in a tidal area of the bay, near a spot that matched the area where Peterson said he had been fishing. Police found that Laci's body showed signs of having been mutilated, and there was evidence that both mother and child had died through violent means. An autopsy revealed that Laci had been strangled, and Connor had been cut from her womb. Investigation and growing suspicion. As the bodies of Laci Peterson and her unborn son, Connor, were recovered from the San Francisco Bay, the investigation into her murder began to take a more definitive shape. Scott Peterson, once the distraught husband of the missing woman, was quickly viewed with growing suspicion. Although Peterson had initially cooperated with the police, the inconsistencies in his statements, his behavior, and his movements raised red flags. Investigators turned their focus squarely on him as they began to piece together the tragic events leading to Laci's death. Scott's movements on the day of Laci's disappearance were one of the first things that raised suspicion. On the morning of December 24, 2002, he told investigators that he had planned to go fishing alone at the Berkeley Marina, a location over 90 miles away from his home. He left his home around 9:30 a.m. and returned around 5:30 p.m., reporting Laci missing when he returned. Peterson claimed he had not seen his wife after he left for fishing and had not noticed anything unusual when he came back home. However, investigators began to unravel a series of inconsistencies. For one, the timeline Peterson provided seemed to be off. The authorities learned that Peterson had not been at the marina when he claimed. A security guard at the marina reported seeing no sign of Peterson, nor was there any record of him being there. There was also the discovery of Scott's cell phone records, which showed that he had been in the vicinity of his home at times that contradicted his statements. This suggested that he had not been fishing during the time he claimed to have been. raising further suspicion. Peterson's behavior was also under intense scrutiny. In the days following Lacey's disappearance, Scott appeared unusually calm, almost indifferent. He was seen smiling, laughing, and casually talking with friends and family. This stark contrast to the grief that would be expected of a man whose wife was missing left. Many people questioning his emotional state, his calmness stood in sharp contrast to the frantic pleas for help that came from Lacey's family, particularly from her mother, Sharon Rocha, and father, Dennis Rocha, who were deeply concerned about their daughter. Even more telling were Scott's interactions with the media and the police. Throughout the investigation, he remained distant, unwilling to engage emotionally. When Lacey's family publicly appealed for help, Scott seemed more focused on his own public image than on his wife's safe return. In a chilling moment, he even appeared on national television, smiling and shaking hands with strangers as though the entire situation was a mere inconvenience rather than a tragic personal loss. Many who witnessed this found it hard to believe that this was the behavior of a man whose wife was missing and whose unborn son was at risk. As the investigation deepened, authorities uncovered more troubling information about Scott Peterson's personal life. It emerged that Peterson had been having an affair with a woman named Amber Frey, a massage therapist from Fresno, California. Scott had met Amber in November 2002, just weeks before Lacey disappeared. Amber later told authorities that Scott had been deceitful about his marital status, claiming he was single when they began their relationship. This affair added a new layer of complexity to the investigation, painting Scott Peterson as someone who may have been emotionally detached from his wife and potentially motivated by something darker. Amber Frey became an important figure in the case. When she cooperated with law enforcement, she recorded phone conversations with Scott Peterson, in which he admitted to lying about being married, and even implied that he was grieving over Lacey's disappearance. The tapes showed a man who, while outwardly speaking about his wife, was emotionally detached and far from the grieving spouse he claimed to be. In one of the most damning revelations, Peterson referred to his wife's disappearance in the past tense, showing that he likely knew long before anyone else that she was dead. The investigation quickly focused on Scott Peterson as the primary suspect. A search of the Peterson home revealed that Lacey's blood was found in a laundry basket, as well as evidence that she had been killed inside their house. Further evidence showed that Scott Peterson had purchased items commonly used to dispose of a body, including tarps and cement, in the days leading up to Lacey's disappearance. These discoveries added to the mounting evidence against him and further isolated him from the public's sympathies. As weeks passed, more information began to surface, and the case began to gather national attention. The media coverage was intense, with daily updates, speculations, and interviews with experts. Peterson was constantly under the public microscope. The investigation had now become a full-scale hunt for the truth, and Scott Peterson was firmly in the crosshairs. While the police were building their case, Lacey's family fought to keep the case in the public eye. Lacey's mother, Sharon Rocha, and her father, Dennis Rocha, publicly spoke out against Scott Peterson, urging him to help find their daughter and demanding that he be fully investigated. Their grief was palpable, and their belief that Scott Peterson had murdered Lacey only grew stronger as the evidence mounted. Arrest, trial, and media frenzy. As the evidence against Scott Peterson mounted, it became clear that the authorities had a strong case. His lies, his suspicious behavior, and the growing trail of forensic evidence led to a turning point in the investigation. On April 18, 2003, just days after the discovery of Lacey Peterson and Connor's bodies, Scott Peterson was arrested and charged with 2 felony counts of murder, one for the death of his wife Lacey, and the other for the death of their unborn child, Connor. The arrest was highly publicized, and the media, which had been covering the case from the beginning, turned its full attention to the man, who was now accused of committing an unspeakable crime. The arrest of Scott Peterson marked the beginning of a lengthy and highly publicized trial. It became one of the most watched trials in American history, with an overwhelming amount of media coverage that kept the nation riveted. Peterson, who had been so confident and seemingly detached throughout the investigation, now found himself at the center of a legal battle that would determine his fate. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Rick DiStasso, quickly laid out its case against Peterson. The core of their argument was that Scott Peterson had intentionally killed his wife and their unborn child, Connor, out of selfishness and greed. They argued that Peterson had no regard for the life of his wife or son, and that he had been carrying on an affair with Amber Frey while plotting his wife's murder. They pointed to his actions in the days leading up to Lacey's death, including his strange behavior, his purchase of items used to dispose of a body, and the damning phone conversations with Amber Frey. Key to the prosecution's case was the timeline of events and the physical evidence that tied Peterson to the crime. The location of the bodies found in the San Francisco Bay was critical to establishing Peterson's guilt. It was argued that Peterson had taken Lacey's body to the marina after killing her, leaving her there to be disposed of in the water. The autopsy findings, which showed that both Lacey and Connor had died violent deaths, strengthened the prosecution's claims of premeditated murder, perhaps one of the most crucial pieces of evidence against Scott. Peterson was the revelation that Lacey had been murdered in the couple's home. Investigators discovered bloodstains in the laundry room, as well as traces of Lacey's blood in various parts of the house. This suggested that Lacey had been attacked inside the home before her body was disposed of in the bay. The prosecution also introduced evidence of Scott Peterson's behavior after Lacey's disappearance, which they argued demonstrated his lack of remorse in his attempts to cover up his crime. The defense, led by attorney Mark Garagos, attempted to discredit the prosecution's case, painting Scott Peterson as a victim of circumstantial evidence and media bias. Garagos argued that there was no concrete proof that Peterson had murdered his wife and son. He claimed that Lacey's death could have been the result of a random attack, and that there was no definitive evidence connecting Peterson to the crime scene. He also pointed out the absence of forensic evidence showing that Scott Peterson had been at the marina on the day of Lacey's disappearance, suggesting that the prosecution had overstated their case. The defense's efforts to weaken the case were met with skepticism from many, but the media coverage of the trial played a significant role in shaping public perception. Peterson's lawyers used the intense media frenzy to argue that Peterson was being treated unfairly by the court of public opinion. The media's portrayal of Scott Peterson was complex. On one hand, he was depicted as a charming and attractive man, but on the other, he was now seen as a cold-blooded murderer. The relentless media coverage influenced the public's opinion, as many believed that Peterson was guilty before the trial even began. The trial itself became a spectacle, with every new development being broadcast live on television. The media obsession with the case reached a fever pitch, with reporters camping outside the courtroom, covering every moment in painstaking detail. In the midst of all the media attention, the emotional toll on Lacey's family was evident. Her parents, Sharon and Dennis Rocha, became vocal advocates for justice, speaking out at every opportunity and maintaining a constant presence in the courtroom. Their grief was palpable, and their determination to see justice served remained unwavering throughout the trial. As the trial continued, more emotional testimony was heard in court. Witnesses, including Lacey's friends and family members, recounted the deep love and joy Lacey had for her unborn child, Connor. Her family described her as a kind and devoted person, someone who would never have deserved such a horrific fate. The emotional testimonies painted a vivid picture of the woman who had been so tragically taken from her family and friends. Despite the defense's attempts to argue for Peterson's innocence, the prosecution's case seemed to be overwhelming. As the trial neared its conclusion, the question that remained was whether Scott Peterson would be convicted of murder. The nation anxiously awaited the verdict, and many believed that justice for Lacey and Connor was within reach. Conviction, aftermath, and legacy. On November 12, 2004, after over 5 months of testimony, the jury in the trial of Scott Peterson reached a verdict. Peterson was found guilty of 2 counts of murder: the first-degree murder of his wife, Lacey Peterson, and the second-degree murder of their unborn son, Connor. The jury deliberated for just under 24 hours before delivering the verdict, which was met with a mixture of emotions from both sides of the courtroom. For Lacey's family, the verdict was a long-awaited moment of justice. But for Scott Peterson, it marked the beginning of the rest of his life in prison. The guilty verdict brought some closure to the case, but it also opened the door to the next phase, the sentencing. In California, the penalty for first-degree murder is either the death penalty or life in prison without the possibility of parole. Peterson's defense team immediately filed an appeal, seeking to avoid the death penalty, but the prosecution argued that Peterson's crime was particularly heinous and deserving of the ultimate punishment. The sentencing phase of the trial began shortly after the conviction, and in December 2004, Scott Peterson was formally sentenced to death by Judge Nancy Ashley. The death penalty sentencing made headlines across the nation, as many debated whether Scott Peterson deserved to die for his crimes. Supporters of the death penalty argued that Peterson's actions were premeditated, and that he had murdered his wife and child in a cold, calculated manner. His betrayal of Lacey's trust, along with the brutality of the murders, led many to believe that he should face the ultimate punishment. Others, however, believed that Peterson should not be sentenced to death, arguing that life in prison was a more appropriate consequence for the loss of Lacey and Connor. Peterson's sentencing was not the end of the saga. Over the following years, the case continued to be a source of public fascination and legal drama. Peterson's defense team filed multiple appeals, arguing that the trial had been unfair and that the jury's decision was influenced by media bias. The legal proceedings dragged on for years, with many questioning whether Scott Peterson would ever be executed or whether his sentence would ultimately be overturned. In 2012, the California Supreme Court ruled that Scott Peterson's conviction would stand, rejecting his claims of ineffective counsel and procedural errors during the trial. However, the court did overturn Peterson's death sentence, citing the fact that the jury had not been properly instructed on certain aspects of the law during the sentencing phase. This decision sent shockwaves through the media, as it sparked renewed debates over the death penalty in California. Despite this, Peterson remained on death row at San Quentin State Prison. As of today, Scott Peterson continues to serve his sentence, and his case remains a subject of intense public interest. His story has been the focus of numerous books, documentaries, and television specials, all of which have explored the details of the crime and the aftermath of the trial. Peterson's case has become a defining moment in the history of American criminal justice, one that prompted a national conversation about the death penalty. The role of the media in shaping public opinion, and the lengths to which someone might go to hide their darkest secrets. Lacey Peterson's family, while enduring years of legal battles and media attention, has remained steadfast in their pursuit of justice. Sharon and Dennis Rocha have used their voices to advocate for victims of domestic violence and to raise awareness about the impact of such crimes on families. Their unwavering commitment to honoring Lacey's memory and to ensuring that her son, Connor, is never forgotten has kept the case alive in the hearts of many Americans. The tragedy of Lacey Peterson's death is a painful reminder of the dangers of domestic violence and the ways in which individuals can manipulate and deceive those closest to them. Scott Peterson's actions devastated a family, and his betrayal of his wife and child shocked the nation. As the years go on, the case continues to be studied and remembered as one of the most haunting and tragic criminal events in modern American history. In the end, the story of Lacey Peterson and her son, Connor, serves as a stark warning about the consequences of betrayal, deceit, and violence. It is a reminder that behind the headlines and the legal battles, real lives are affected by the actions of one individual, and that justice, while sometimes delayed, can eventually be served. The Loomis Fargo robbery, a bold heist. On September 12, 1997, one of the most audacious and well-executed bank heists in American history took place in Charlotte, North Carolina. What started as a seemingly routine day at the Loomis Fargo vault quickly spiraled into a highly orchestrated crime that would become the stuff of legend. The robbers had managed to steal $17.3 million, making it one of the largest cash heists in U.S. history at the time. The theft was not carried out by a gang of hardened criminals or armed men on the streets, but by a group of individuals who had insider knowledge of the workings of the company they targeted. Loomis Fargo, a well-established armored transport company, was responsible for securely transporting and storing large sums of money for financial institutions and businesses across the country. The company's Charlotte branch housed a vault containing millions of dollars in cash, and it was this very vault that became the focal point of the crime. The mastermind behind the heist was none other than David Scott Gaunt, a 26-year-old vault supervisor who worked for Loomis Fargo. Gaunt had access to the company, its operations, and knew the inner workings of the security systems and processes like the back of his hand. What made this case unique was the fact that Gaunt didn't act alone. He had help from an unlikely group of accomplices, including his fiancée, Michelle Marchante, and her brother, as well as a handful of other individuals. They didn't fit the stereotypical image of seasoned criminals, but together they pulled off one of the most carefully planned and executed heists in recent memory. Gaunt had been planning the robbery for several months before finally deciding to take the plunge. David Gant had worked for Loomis Fargo for several years, and during that time, he became familiar with the company's routines and procedures. He knew when the money was moved, where it was stored, and the time windows in which the vault was most vulnerable. Gant had an understanding of the company's security systems, and perhaps most importantly, he knew how to exploit weaknesses in the system. The timing of the heist was critical. Gaunt waited until the day that the company was preparing for a routine transfer of funds, which created a window of opportunity for him to execute the robbery. On the morning of September 12th, Gaunt took his opportunity. He arrived at the Loomis Fargo branch as usual, but instead of simply fulfilling his duties, he decided to steal millions of dollars in cash. Gaunt had already disabled the security cameras in the vault area, and by the time his colleagues realized something was wrong, he was already well on his way to executing the crime. He loaded $17.3 million into a company van, and using his knowledge of the security protocols, managed to leave the premises without alerting anyone. To carry out the heist, Gaunt had enlisted the help of Michelle Marchant, his fiancée, who was a key part of the plan. Marchante's role in the crime was to help with the logistics of moving the stolen money. After Gaunt made off with the cash, he met up with Marchant and the others who had been in on the plan. They were set to take the money and stash it, with the idea that they would keep a low profile until the heat from the robbery died down. While Gaunt and his accomplices thought they had covered their tracks, they soon realized that a crime of this magnitude would not go unnoticed for long. Loomis Fargo immediately reported the theft, and the FBI was soon involved. However, Gaunt, who thought he had pulled off the perfect crime, underestimated the resources of the authorities and the vast network of intelligence available to law enforcement. The investigation was launched with full force, and as the FBI began piecing together the events leading up to the heist, they quickly identified Gaunt as the prime suspect. His behavior was suspicious, and law enforcement officials began to dig deeper into his personal life, including his relationship with Michelle Marchante and the other people involved. The more they looked, the more the pieces began to fall into place. What seemed to be a clean escape was becoming increasingly difficult to cover up. As the FBI closed in on the suspects, they started to focus on the money itself. Gaunt and his accomplices had been careful to try and hide the stolen cash, but it wasn't long before investigators found traces of the money. The stolen cash was no longer simply a pile of cash locked in a vault. It had become a trail of evidence, leading directly to the criminals. The question now was not whether the criminals would be caught, but when and how long they could maintain their cover. The investigation unfolds in the search for the money. As the FBI and local law enforcement launched their investigation, they quickly realized that the scope of the Loomis Fargo robbery was far more complex than they had initially anticipated. With millions of dollars gone, the authorities knew that they had to act quickly to track down the stolen money and the individuals responsible for the crime. The sheer scale of the theft was staggering, and the involvement of an insider, David Gaunt, a vault supervisor, added an additional layer of complexity to the case. The first breakthrough came when investigators learned that Gaunt had been living far beyond his means in the weeks following the heist. Gaunt had been a relatively low-paid employee at Loomis Fargo, but after the robbery, his spending habits seemed inconsistent with his income. He had purchased a new vehicle, took expensive trips, and began living a lavish lifestyle, all of which raised red flags. This sudden and unexplained wealth was a clear indicator that something was amiss, and it prompted investigators to turn their focus onto Gaunt himself. As investigators delved deeper into Gaunt's personal life, they discovered a series of suspicious transactions and unusual behavior. They also learned that Gaunt had been in close contact with Michelle Marchant, his fiancée, who was believed to be complicit in the crime. In fact, it became clear that Gaunt had enlisted the help of several other individuals, many of whom were friends and family members, to help him cover up the crime. The group had planned the heist meticulously, and they had been careful to leave as few traces of evidence as possible. However, as is often the case with large-scale criminal operations, mistakes were made, and the authorities were able to use those errors to their advantage. The FBI began to piece together the timeline of events leading up to the heist. They learned that Gaunt had disabled the security cameras in the vault area, which had given him the opportunity to steal the cash without being caught on tape. However, the cameras in other parts of the building had recorded important information that would eventually lead authorities to the suspects. The investigation revealed that Gant had used his inside knowledge to manipulate the system and avoid triggering any alarms. He had known exactly when the money would be transported and when the vault would be vulnerable, which made his crime seem almost too perfect to be true. Despite the careful planning, Gant and his accomplices had made several crucial mistakes. One of the most glaring errors was their failure to lay low after the heist. They had assumed that the FBI would never be able to track down the stolen money, but the authorities were relentless in their pursuit. Using forensic accounting techniques, investigators were able to trace the stolen cash as it was moved through various channels, including bank deposits and wire transfers. Slowly but surely, the FBI began to close in on the criminals. As the investigation continued, the role of Michelle Marchante became increasingly significant. Investigators discovered that she had been instrumental in helping Gaunt launder the stolen money. She had also played a key role in helping to stash the cash, using her connections to move the money without raising suspicion. Marchante had made several large deposits into various bank accounts, and the authorities were able to link these deposits to the stolen cash. This led them to believe that Marchante was not only an accomplice, but an active participant in the planning and execution of the heist. The FBI also discovered that Gaunt and his accomplices had used false identities and phony documents to cover their tracks. They had set up fake businesses and bank accounts to launder the money, but they had failed to account for the intense scrutiny of the FBI. As the investigation unfolded, the authorities began to unravel the complex web of lies and deception that had been built around the heist. Gaunt, Marchante, and the others involved had underestimated the resources and determination of law enforcement, and it was only a matter of time before they would be caught. Meanwhile, Gaunt, who had fled to Mexico after the robbery, was trying to live under the radar, but his lavish spending and careless behavior drew the attention of authorities there as well. It didn't take long for the FBI to track him down. In the months following the heist, Gaunt began to grow more and more paranoid as law enforcement closed in on him. He had assumed that the money would allow him to live a life of luxury, but instead, it had brought him nothing but suspicion and fear. His once carefully constructed escape plan was falling apart, and he realized that it was only a matter of time before he would be apprehended. The capture and the fallout. As the investigation into the Loomis Fargo robbery continued to unfold, the FBI's efforts were beginning to pay off. The intricate web of deception and the criminal network surrounding David Gant and Michelle Marchante was gradually being unraveled. The stolen money was being traced through various channels, and the trail led directly to the perpetrators. Gaunt's arrogance and poor decisions would prove to be his undoing. The turning point in the investigation came when Gaunt made the critical mistake of attempting to move to Mexico. After the heist, Gaunt had fled Charlotte, hoping to escape the heat of the investigation. He crossed the U.S. border and moved into a small town in Mexico, where he assumed he could lay low with the stolen money. However, his lavish lifestyle and excessive spending did not go unnoticed. Gaunt had purchased a new vehicle, lived in a comfortable home, and frequented high-end restaurants and casinos. His actions drew the attention of local law enforcement, who became suspicious of the American man living so extravagantly for no apparent reason. The FBI, through an extensive network of international law enforcement agencies, was able to track Gaunt's movements. They were already aware of his connection to the Loomis Fargo heist and had been working with Mexican authorities to locate him. As Gaunt's presence in the area became more conspicuous, it wasn't long before law enforcement was able to track him down. The FBI quickly coordinated with Mexican authorities, who arrested David Gaunt in a small Mexican town in early 1998, just a few months after the heist. Gaunt was taken into custody and eventually extradited to the United States to face charges related to the robbery. The arrest of Gaunt was a major milestone in the case, but it was just the beginning of a long legal battle. Along with Gaunt, Michelle Marchante was also arrested and charged with conspiracy to commit robbery, money laundering, and other related offenses. Several other individuals involved in the plot, including Marchante's brother and other accomplices, were also arrested in connection with the crime. The group's plan had fallen apart, and the authorities now had most of them in custody. What followed was a series of dramatic legal proceedings. Gaunt's defense team argued that he had acted impulsively and under the influence of others, particularly Michel Marchante, who had been the primary instigator of the heist. However, the prosecution had a strong case. They presented evidence of Gaunt's meticulous planning, his insider knowledge of the Loomis Fargo vault, and his key role in executing the robbery. Gaunt's defense was ultimately unsuccessful, as the evidence overwhelmingly pointed to him as the mastermind behind the crime. He had carefully studied the security systems, disabled the cameras, and taken advantage of the time window when the money was being transported. During this time, Michel Marchant and the other members of the group were also under investigation. Marchante's role in the heist was becoming clearer, and investigators were starting to link her actions to the stolen money. Eventually, she was arrested along with several other members of the group, and the FBI began to piece together the full scope of the conspiracy. The authorities learned that the group had been planning the heist for months, and Gaunt had meticulously worked out every detail to ensure that the crime would go undetected. However, they also realized that the criminals had made a fatal flaw. They had underestimated the skill and perseverance of the FBI. The capture and the fallout. As the investigation into the Loomis Fargo robbery continued to unfold, the FBI's efforts were beginning to pay off. The intricate web of deception and the criminal network surrounding David Gant and Michel Marchante was gradually being unraveled. The stolen money was being traced through various channels, and the trail led directly to the perpetrators. Gaunt's arrogance and poor decisions would prove to be his undoing. The turning point in the investigation came when Gaunt made the critical mistake of attempting to move to Mexico. After the heist, Gaunt had fled Charlotte, hoping to escape the heat of the investigation. He crossed the U.S. border and moved into a small town in Mexico, where he assumed he could lay low with the stolen money. However, his lavish lifestyle and excessive spending did not go unnoticed. Gaunt had purchased a new vehicle, lived in a comfortable home, and frequented high-end restaurants and casinos. His actions drew the attention of local law enforcement, who became suspicious of the American man living so extravagantly for no apparent reason. The FBI, through an extensive network of international law enforcement agencies, was able to track Gaunt's movements. They were already aware of his connection to the Loomis Fargo heist and had been working with Mexican authorities to locate him. As Gaunt's presence in the area became more conspicuous, it wasn't long before law enforcement was able to track him down. The FBI quickly coordinated with Mexican authorities, who arrested David Gaunt in a small Mexican town in early 1998, just a few months after the heist. Gaunt was taken into custody and eventually extradited to the United States to face charges related to the robbery. The arrest of Gaunt was a major milestone in the case, but it was just the beginning of a long legal battle. Along with Gaunt, Michel Marchant was also arrested and charged with conspiracy to commit robbery, money laundering, and other related offenses. Several other individuals involved in the plot, including Marchante's brother and other accomplices, were also arrested in connection with the crime. The group's plan had fallen apart, and the authorities now had most of them in custody. What followed was a series of dramatic legal proceedings. Gaunt's defense team argued that he had acted impulsively and under the influence of others, particularly Michel Marchante, who had been the primary instigator of the heist. However, the prosecution had a strong case. They presented evidence of Gaunt's meticulous planning, his insider knowledge of the Loomis Fargo vault, and his key role in executing the robbery. Gaunt's defense was ultimately unsuccessful, as the evidence overwhelmingly pointed to him as the mastermind behind the crime. He had carefully studied the security systems, disabled the cameras, and taken advantage of the time window when the money was being transported. In addition to Gaunt and Marchante, several other members of the group received prison sentences for their involvement in the robbery. Some were given lengthy sentences for conspiracy, money laundering, and other crimes related to the heist, the money that had been stolen. $17.3 million was partially recovered, but much of it had already been laundered or spent. Despite the authorities' best efforts to track down every last dollar, a significant portion of the stolen cash was never recovered, and many of the criminals were left with little more than the memories of a crime gone wrong. The aftermath of the Loomis Fargo Robbery left a lasting impact on the individuals involved and on the criminal justice system. For David Gant, the heist had not provided the financial freedom he had hoped for. Instead, it led to a lifetime behind bars. Gant was sentenced to 7 years in prison for his role in the crime, but the fallout from the robbery would continue to affect his life long after his sentence was served. He had thought he could escape the consequences, but in the end, justice caught up with him. Michelle Marchante, who had played a central role in the planning and execution of the heist, received a similar sentence. Her involvement in laundering the money and assisting Gant in covering up the crime had made her an accomplice in the eyes of the law. She was sentenced to prison and would serve time for her participation in the robbery. As the investigation wound down and the criminals faced their sentences, many of the victims, particularly the employees of Loomis Fargo, were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. The Loomis Fargo robbery became a cautionary tale in the world of heists. It was a reminder that even the most carefully planned crimes could eventually be unraveled by law enforcement. It also raised questions about the role of insiders in major heists, as Gant's position within Loomis Fargo had given him a significant advantage in pulling off the robbery. The case also highlighted the importance of forensic accounting and the tireless efforts of law enforcement to track down criminals, no matter how well they thought they had hidden their tracks. The legacy and continued interest in the Loomis Fargo heist. The Loomis Fargo robbery, while over 2 decades old, has remained a case that continues to capture public fascination. It stands as a reminder of the lengths to which individuals are willing to go in pursuit of wealth and the unexpected ways in which their plans can unravel. While many heists throughout history are carried out by organized crime syndicates, the Loomis Fargo robbery was carried out by relatively ordinary individuals, many of whom had no prior criminal experience. The story of David Gant and his co-conspirators has remained a source of intrigue for journalists, filmmakers, and the public alike. One of the most enduring elements of the case is the portrayal of the criminals themselves. Gant, Michel Marchant, and the others involved did not fit the typical mold of hardened criminals. Gant, in particular, was an unlikely mastermind. He was an employee at Loomis Fargo, a job that was typically considered mundane and secure, yet he exploited his position and knowledge of the company's operations to pull off the heist. His naivete and poor decisions, such as his reckless spending and inability to lay low after the robbery, became central to the narrative of the case. Over the years, numerous books, documentaries, and movies have explored the details of the Loomis Fargo robbery, bringing it back into the public eye. One of the most notable adaptations was the 2016 film Masterminds, starring Zach Galifianakis, Kristen Wiig, and Owen Wilson. The film, which is a loose and comedic retelling of the heist, brought attention to the absurdity of the situation, with the filmmakers playing up the humor in the criminals' bungling of the crime. While the film took artistic liberties and used a comedic tone, it did capture the essence of how a heist that seemed foolproof at first became a catastrophic failure. The film's portrayal of Gant as a bumbling, clueless character contrasted sharply with the real-life events of the robbery. Gant had not planned to be caught. In fact, he had carefully devised his escape. But his lack of sophistication in evading law enforcement, combined with his reckless lifestyle, led to his downfall. The way the case was handled by law enforcement, as well as the eventual fallout for the perpetrators, has made it a textbook example of how large-scale heists are investigated and prosecuted. The meticulousness of the FBI's investigation and their determination to follow the money and trace it through various channels played a critical role in securing the criminals' arrests. Another lingering aspect of the Loomis Fargo case is the question of what could have been had the criminals been smarter, more patient, or less reckless. Many experts in criminology and law enforcement have cited the case as an example of how even well-planned crimes can be undone by poor execution. Gant's inability to keep a low profile and his overconfidence led to his capture. His associates made similar mistakes, leaving behind traces of the stolen money and drawing attention to their involvement. Had they been more cautious, they might have evaded capture for much longer. But their hubris and failure to plan for the long term were ultimately their undoing. The long-term impact of the Loomis Fargo robbery also extends to the families and victims affected by the crime. Although the money was eventually recovered, much of the stolen cash was never returned, and the psychological toll on the employees of Loomis Fargo was significant. The robbery not only disrupted the company's operations, but it also tarnished its reputation. Many of the employees involved in the heist had no idea that one of their colleagues was behind the crime, and the betrayal of trust was a difficult pill to swallow. Gant's actions also had a profound effect on the victim's sense of security, as they learned that the person they had trusted with handling millions of dollars was the very one who had stolen from them. As of today, the Loomis Fargo robbery remains a case that is frequently revisited in the media, often serving as a symbol of how greed, poor decision-making, and an overestimation of one's own abilities can lead to a catastrophic downfall. David Gant, who had hoped to live a life of luxury, now serves as a cautionary tale. He may have believed that a life of crime would bring him freedom, but instead, it resulted in the complete opposite, a prison sentence, the loss of his reputation, and a legacy of failure. Ultimately, the Loomis Fargo robbery is remembered not just for the staggering amount of money stolen, but for the human drama that unfolded behind the scenes. It was a crime that seemed at first to be the perfect heist, planned down to the finest detail, executed by individuals with inside knowledge, and hidden beneath layers of deception. But in the end, it was a story of human flaws, greed, overconfidence, and an inability to consider the long-term consequences of their actions. And despite their best efforts to cover their tracks, the criminals were caught, the money was traced, and justice was served. The 1952 Harry Winston diamond heist, a daring robbery. On the morning of December 5, 1952, the world witnessed one of the most daring and high-profile diamond heists in history. The location was Harry Winston, a renowned and prestigious jewelry store on Fifth Avenue in New York City, which had been a fixture in the luxury market for over 80 years. This heist would become infamous not only for the scale of the theft, but also for the audacity with which it was carried out. Harry Winston was a name synonymous with luxury, and the store's clientele included royalty, celebrities, and the wealthiest individuals across the globe. Within the store, nestled in a vault that only a select few could access, lay a dazzling collection of diamonds and precious gems that were worth millions of dollars. These jewels were coveted by many, and to the criminals who orchestrated the heist, they represented a treasure trove ripe for the taking. But what made this robbery particularly remarkable was that it wasn't a highly organized syndicate of criminals behind the plot. Instead, a group of thieves, referred to in the press as the Winston Gang, executed the robbery with alarming precision and confidence, relying not on brute force but on sheer audacity. The mastermind behind the heist was a man named Vittorio Victor Massari, an Italian immigrant with a criminal background in Europe. Massari, who had a history of petty crime, had come to New York in the early 1950s. His ambition had grown over time, and he sought to make his mark on the criminal underworld of the United States. He was not working alone. Massari had recruited a small group of accomplices, each of whom played a specific role in the robbery. The group included two seasoned criminals, Giuseppe Joe Papalardo and Tony Romano, both experienced jewel thieves who had been involved in several heists across Europe and the US. They were joined by a woman, Teresa Terry Bennett, whose role was to act as a diversion and assist in the manipulation of the security systems. The plot to rob Harry Winston had been brewing for months. Massari and his associates knew that the jewelry store was a prime target, and they spent weeks meticulously observing the comings and goings of the staff, customers, and security personnel. They learned the routines of the store, the timing of deliveries, and the hours during which the vault was most vulnerable. They also paid close attention to the store's security measures, understanding that Harry Winston had a reputation for keeping its jewels under tight security. Despite this, Massari and his crew believed they had found a way to bypass the security system and access the vault. On the day of the heist, Massari and his accomplices made their move. Dressed in perfectly tailored suits and sporting a well-practiced air of professionalism, the group entered the Harry Winston store at around 10:00 a.m. The store was bustling with customers, and the employees were distracted by the normal flow of business. The thieves were well aware that the store would be filled with people during this time, and their plan relied on the fact that the staff would not suspect them to be criminals. They also knew that the store's high-profile reputation would likely discourage anyone from thinking that a robbery could take place during daylight hours. Massari and his team moved swiftly, quickly taking control of the store and disabling the security system. Teresa Bennett, posing as a well-dressed customer, distracted the staff and helped to divert attention away from the vault. Pappalardo and Romano were the ones who had been tasked with accessing the precious gems, and they had brought with them tools that would allow them to bypass the security systems. They had been planning their entry for months and knew exactly how to disable the alarms and surveillance cameras. The thieves managed to bypass the vault's complex security mechanisms, which were designed to keep even the most determined criminals at bay. They did not rely on brute force or violence, but instead used their knowledge of the security system to manipulate the timing of the vault's locks and alarms. Within minutes, the vault doors were open, and the thieves had access to millions of dollars worth of diamonds, emeralds, and other precious gems. The entire heist was executed with eerie precision. Massari, Pappalardo, and Romano filled bags with as much as they could carry, carefully selecting the most valuable pieces from the vault. Meanwhile, Bennett continued to act as a decoy, keeping the employees distracted and preventing any interference from security. When the robbers had taken everything they wanted, they exited the store as calmly and as professionally as they had entered. They left behind no trace of their presence, no fingerprints, no DNA, and no obvious signs that a robbery had taken place. For all intents and purposes, the heist appeared to have been carried out by professionals who knew exactly what they were doing. The robbery was discovered shortly after the thieves had fled the scene. Store employees, who had been busy with customers, realized that something was wrong when they went to check on the vault and found it empty. At first, they assumed that it was some sort of mistake or misunderstanding. But as they investigated further, the magnitude of the crime became clear. The entire inventory of valuable gemstones had been taken. Immediately, Harry Winston's staff alerted the police, and an investigation was launched. On the day of the heist, Massari and his accomplices made their move. Dressed in perfectly tailored suits and sporting a well-practiced air of professionalism, the group entered the Harry Winston store at around 10 a.m. The store was bustling with customers, and the employees were distracted by the normal flow of business. The thieves were well aware that the store would be filled with people during this time, and their plan relied on the fact that the staff would not suspect them to be criminals. They also knew that the store's high-profile reputation would likely discourage anyone from thinking that a robbery could take place during daylight hours. Massari and his team moved swiftly, quickly taking control of the store and disabling the security system. Teresa Bennett, posing as a well-dressed customer, distracted the staff and helped to divert attention away from the vault. Pappalardo and Romano were the ones who had been tasked with accessing the precious gems, and they had brought with them tools that would allow them to bypass the security systems. They had been planning their entry for months and knew exactly how to disable the alarms and surveillance cameras. The thieves managed to bypass the vault's complex security mechanisms, which were designed to keep even the most determined criminals at bay. They did not rely on brute force or violence, but instead used their knowledge of the security system to manipulate the timing of the vault's locks and alarms. Within minutes, the vault doors were open, and the thieves had access to millions of dollars worth of diamonds, emeralds, and other precious gems. The entire heist was executed with eerie precision. Massari, Pappalardo, and Romano filled bags with as much as they could carry, carefully selecting the most valuable pieces from the vault. Meanwhile, Bennett continued to act as a decoy, keeping the employees distracted and preventing any interference from security. When the robbers had taken everything they wanted, they exited the store as calmly and as professionally as they had entered. They left behind no trace of their presence, no fingerprints, no DNA, and no obvious signs that a robbery had taken place. For all intents and purposes, the heist appeared to have been carried out by professionals who knew exactly what they were doing. The robbery was discovered shortly after the thieves had fled the scene. Store employees, who had been busy with customers, realized that something was wrong when they went to check on the vault and found it empty. At first, they assumed that it was some sort of mistake or misunderstanding, but as they investigated further, the magnitude of the crime became clear. The entire inventory of valuable gemstones had been taken. Immediately, Harry Winston's staff alerted the police, and an investigation was launched. The response from law enforcement was swift. Detectives and FBI agents quickly flooded the scene, and the news of the robbery made headlines across the country. Harry Winston's reputation was damaged, but the true extent of the loss wasn't immediately clear. The stolen gems were worth millions of dollars, but their exact value was difficult to determine due to the sheer rarity and uniqueness of some of the pieces. What the authorities did know was that the robbers had executed their plan with an eerie calmness and attention to detail. Whoever was behind the crime had clearly done their homework. The investigation and initial leads. In the wake of the robbery, law enforcement was left with a series of difficult questions and very few immediate answers. The meticulous nature of the heist made it clear that the criminals had been planning this for some time, and the precision with which they executed the robbery suggested they were professionals. Despite the lack of physical evidence left at the scene, the investigation began in earnest, with detectives from the NYPD, along with agents from the FBI, joining forces to track down the culprits. The first step in the investigation was to reconstruct the events of the robbery. The employees and customers in the store provided statements, but many had not seen anything unusual. The thieves had chosen a time when the store was bustling with activity, and they blended in seamlessly with the crowd. However, there was one significant lead that the police began to focus on: the timing of the heist. The criminals had struck in broad daylight, likely because they knew that the store's security system would be more vulnerable at that particular moment. The timing seemed too precise to be coincidental, and investigators began to wonder whether the criminals had been inside the store before, possibly casing it out under the guise of customers or staff. It quickly became clear that someone inside the store might have been involved, either as a direct accomplice or as an unwitting informant. With this in mind, the police turned their attention to Harry Winston's employees. They interviewed the staff and the management, but no one seemed to have any knowledge of the criminals or their plans. The employees were baffled by the robbery and insisted that they had no idea how it had happened. However, there were some subtle inconsistencies in the stories that caught the attention of the investigators. For instance, some of the employees had claimed they had seen a man, who later turned out to be one of the thieves, entering the store in the weeks leading up to the heist. This individual had reportedly been acting strangely, spending time admiring the jewelry and asking questions about the security system. The investigators also turned to the store's security footage. However, much to their frustration, the robbers had already disabled the cameras before making their move. This was one of the most critical aspects of their plan. The thieves had known exactly how to disable the security system, ensuring that no visual evidence was left behind. As a result, the police had no surveillance footage of the criminals entering the store, the actual theft, or their escape. Despite these setbacks, the authorities were not without resources. They knew that the diamonds and gemstones taken during the robbery were likely to surface on the black market, and they began working with jewelers, antique dealers, and underground contacts to see if the stolen goods were being offered for sale. The value of the diamonds was so high that it would be difficult for the thieves to simply sit on them without trying to sell them, and law enforcement hoped that one of the stolen gems might eventually lead them to the criminals. Meanwhile, the FBI began to delve into the backgrounds of known criminals in the area, hoping to find connections to the heist. They started by examining the criminal records of individuals who had been involved in similar heists, particularly those that targeted high-end jewelry stores. It wasn't long before a name surfaced: Vittorio Massari. Massari's name had been linked to a series of robberies in Europe, and he had been known to associate with a network of professional jewel thieves. His criminal background made him a prime suspect, and the authorities quickly began to focus their efforts on tracking him down. However, Massari had proven to be a difficult target. He was elusive, and there were conflicting reports about his whereabouts. Some said he had left the United States shortly after the heist, while others believed he was still hiding out in New York, lying low to avoid suspicion. His reputation as a skilled and calculated criminal made him even more dangerous, and law enforcement knew that they had to move carefully to avoid tipping him off. The search for Massari and his crew was intense, and for several months, the authorities seemed to hit dead ends at every turn. The stolen jewels had disappeared without a trace, and the criminal network that had been suspected of involvement remained elusive. As the months dragged on, the case began to lose momentum. New York newspapers continued to report on the heist, but without any significant developments. Public interest in the case began to wane. However, a breakthrough came in the form of a tip from an unlikely source: a small-time criminal who had been arrested on unrelated charges in Philadelphia provided a crucial lead. This informant had connections to the underground jewel trade and claimed to have overheard a conversation about a large batch of diamonds being sold on the black market. The diamonds, the informant said, were believed to be part of the haul from the Harry Winston robbery. The authorities quickly seized upon this lead, tracking down the informant's contacts and working their way through the underground network of jewel thieves. It wasn't long before they learned that several of the stolen diamonds were being sold to a prominent European jeweler in Paris. With this information in hand, the FBI coordinated with French authorities, launching an international investigation to track the diamonds and ultimately the criminals behind the heist. As the investigation continued to unfold, the authorities began to close in on the remaining members of Massari's gang. Pappalardo, Romano, and Bennett were all brought in for questioning, and their involvement in the robbery became increasingly clear. Romano in particular proved to be a weak link. Under pressure, he began to crack, providing details about the planning and execution of the heist. His confession helped the authorities put together the final pieces of the puzzle and identify Massari as the ringleader behind the robbery, the hunt for the thieves, and their capture. As the investigation continued, the search for Massari and his crew intensified. With the breakthrough involving the tip-off from the informant, law enforcement agencies across multiple countries began to coordinate efforts. The stolen diamonds had been traced to Paris, and French authorities quickly became involved in the operation. Given the international scope of the crime, the FBI enlisted the help of Interpol to track down the criminals, who were believed to have sold the diamonds on the black market. With Romano's confession providing crucial details, the FBI was able to pinpoint the locations where the stolen gems had been smuggled. At the same time, a task force was set up to keep an eye on the individuals known to be involved in the underground jewelry trade. Detectives and agents scoured Paris's antique markets and luxury jewelry shops, knowing that any attempt to sell such high-value gems would likely attract attention. As the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together, law enforcement realized they were getting closer to the culprits. Massari, the mastermind behind the heist, was still in hiding, but it appeared that he had underestimated the authorities' ability to track him down. Although he had gone to great lengths to remain out of sight, his network of contacts was beginning to crack under the pressure of law enforcement. Romano's confession, combined with new intelligence gathered by the FBI, confirmed Massari's whereabouts in a small village on the outskirts of Rome, Italy. The FBI, together with Italian authorities, planned a coordinated operation to arrest Massari. Given the importance of this case and the complexity of international law enforcement collaboration, the operation was executed with a high degree of secrecy. Any misstep could allow Massari to flee once again. While Massari was holed up in Italy, the rest of his crew, Pappalardo, Bennett, and Romano, were scattered across various locations, each trying to lay low and avoid detection. But law enforcement wasn't about to let the criminals get away. Italian authorities were able to track down Pappalardo first. He had been living in a secluded area in northern Italy, attempting to blend in with the local population. Despite his best efforts to avoid capture, he was arrested by Italian police after a brief surveillance operation. Pappalardo was extradited to the United States, where he was charged with conspiracy, theft, and involvement in organized crime. He quickly became an important witness in the case, providing investigators with more details about the planning and execution of the heist, as well as Massari's role as the ringleader. Meanwhile, Tony Romano, the third member of the crew, had been staying in a small coastal town in southern Spain. Law enforcement had been tracking his movements for weeks, and after a series of coordinated raids and surveillance operations, Romano was captured without incident. His capture, however, did not lead to a confession, and he remained tight-lipped during his interrogation. Romano's reluctance to talk made it clear that he was trying to protect Massari, whom he viewed as the mastermind behind the robbery. Nonetheless, his arrest brought law enforcement one step closer to completing the investigation. The final member of the group, Teresa Terry Bennett, had disappeared after the heist, but her role in the crime had made her a key figure in the investigation. While Bennett had served as the decoy, distracting employees and preventing them from noticing the thieves as they executed the robbery, it was clear she had played an integral part in the operation. She had been involved in the planning, and there were reports of her moving significant sums of money in the weeks following the heist. Authorities were concerned that she might try to escape the country, so a global search was launched for her. It was not until several months later that Bennett was finally located in Canada. She had been living under an alias, moving between various cities in an attempt to evade law enforcement. But the authorities were persistent, and with the help of Canadian law enforcement, Bennett was arrested in Montreal. She was extradited to the United States to stand trial, where she, too, was charged with conspiracy, theft, and accessory to the crime. Unlike Romano, Bennett was willing to cooperate with the authorities. Her confession provided further details about Massari's criminal network and how they had managed to execute the heist without raising suspicion. With all the major players in the heist either in custody or apprehended, Massari's capture became the next goal for law enforcement. The operation to track him down was complicated by his careful planning and his ability to move between countries undetected. Massari had been hiding out in a remote village in Italy, using false identities and relying on a network of criminal contacts to remain undetected. However, the increasing pressure on his associates and his mounting fear of arrest led him to make a critical mistake. On the run for several months, Massari became increasingly paranoid and began making erratic movements that law enforcement was able to trace. In early 1953, Massari was finally tracked down to a small cabin in the Italian Alps. With the help of local police and the FBI, a final raid was conducted. Massari was arrested without incident and was brought back to the United States to face charges for his involvement in the Harry Winston diamond heist. His capture marked the end of an extensive investigation that had spanned several countries and months of careful planning. While Massari had tried to cover his tracks, his greed and carelessness ultimately led to his downfall. The trial, convictions, and aftermath. As the criminals were captured, the final stage of the investigation began. The trial. The stolen diamonds had been recovered, and the authorities had gathered enough evidence to charge the suspects with a range of crimes, including theft, conspiracy, and organized criminal activity. While the investigation had taken months, the legal proceedings were swift, as the prosecution had a strong case against the defendants. The public attention surrounding the case only grew as the trial date approached, and the media covered the proceedings extensively. The trial of the Harry Winston diamond heist gang began in early 1954. The defendants, Vittorio Massari, Giuseppe Pappalardo, Tony Romano, and Teresa Bennett, were all charged with conspiring to steal millions of dollars worth of diamonds from one of the most prestigious jewelry stores in the world. Each of the defendants faced serious charges, and prosecutors were determined to see that they were held accountable for their roles in the heist. Massari, the ringleader, was the focus of the trial. His role in orchestrating the heist was well documented, and the prosecution presented detailed evidence of his planning, including his recruitment of Pappalardo, Romano, and Bennett, as well as his meticulous preparation for the robbery. Massari's defense team argued that he had been coerced into committing the crime, but the jury found this argument unconvincing. The evidence against him was overwhelming. His fingerprints had been found on documents relating to the planning of the heist, and his involvement in the sale of the stolen diamonds was clear. Pappalardo, Romano, and Bennett also faced significant charges. Pappalardo, who had been arrested in Italy and extradited to the U.S., admitted to his role in the robbery and cooperated with authorities in exchange for a more lenient sentence. His testimony was critical in piecing together the full extent of the operation. Romano, despite his silence during interrogation, was convicted based on the evidence presented by law enforcement and the testimony of his fellow conspirators. Bennett, who had played a crucial role in distracting the store employees during the heist, was the last of the group to face trial. Though she had cooperated with the authorities and provided detailed information about the crime, her involvement in the heist led to a conviction. In the end, Massari was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison for his role as the mastermind behind the heist. Pappalardo received a sentence of 15 years, while Romano and Bennett were each sentenced to 12 years. The trial not only marked the end of the legal process, but also served as a cautionary tale about the risks of organized crime and the consequences of attempting to steal from the wealthy and powerful. The aftermath of the heist had far-reaching consequences. The Harry Winston jewelry store, despite the loss of a significant portion of its valuable inventory, was able to recover over time. The stolen diamonds were recovered, and many of them were returned to the store after being smuggled back into the U.S. via international law enforcement, cooperation. The store's reputation, while somewhat tarnished, remained strong, and Harry Winston continued to be a leading name in the luxury jewelry business. For Masari and his crew, the consequences were severe. The years spent planning and executing the heist had ultimately led them to a life behind bars. While some of the stolen gems were recovered, the criminals were left with little to show for their efforts but prison sentences and the destruction of their criminal careers. The case remained in the public eye for years, with the media covering every twist and turn of the investigation and trial. The heist was also a turning point in the way high-end jewelry stores handled security. In the years following the robbery, Harry Winston and other luxury jewelers across the country implemented state-of-the-art security measures to prevent similar crimes from happening again. This included advanced surveillance systems, increased manpower, and improved vault security. The lessons learned from the Harry Winston heist helped shape the security practices of many prestigious businesses, ensuring that future generations of thieves would have a much harder time accessing the wealth hidden behind locked doors and tight security. The Harry Winston diamond heist is remembered as one of the most audacious and meticulously executed robberies in American history. It stands as a testament to the power of careful planning, but also to the ultimate futility of attempting to outsmart the law. In the end, the criminals were caught, and their ill-gotten gains were returned to their rightful owner. Though the heist itself was a triumph for the thieves in the short term, their downfall was swift and complete. Today, the heist is still discussed in the context of famous robberies, and the story of Masari and his crew remains a cautionary tale for those who believe that crime, no matter how carefully planned, can never truly pay off.